morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. Welcome to our Saturday History Brunch series. Today's topic is military mountaineers, 10th Mountain Division, World War II. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Juergens. Dr. Juergens is curator of the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Previously, he served as the Brunch, curator of military history at History Colorado, which is home to the historic 10th Mountain Division. Dr. Juergens, over to yours.
There we go. All right, well, good morning. Thank you, first of all, to the Frontier Army Museum for having me. And thank you all for taking some time out of your Saturday to come by here and hear about the 10th Mountain Division, World War II. This is a story that's really near and dear to my heart. As mentioned, I worked in the 10th Mountain Division collection in Colorado for a number of years. It's a really remarkable collection. I'll say a couple things about that real quick because some people are surprised that it's there and its scope. So in the 1980s, the World War II generation was entering retirement, and they were thinking about their legacy, and they wanted to preserve this history somewhere. They had very active reunions all through the years, and they had great camaraderie in the division, and so they wanted to find a home for their stories and for their objects. And so they worked out a pretty unique agreement with the Colorado Historical Society and with the Denver Public Library to preserve all of this material. So we really have a wealth of information to draw from, thousands of artifacts, hundreds of thousands of pages of memoirs, letters, morning reports, that sort of thing, and also tons and tons of photographs we could draw from. So this presentation draws a lot from those collections, and we also recently had a 5,000 square foot exhibit about the 10th Mountain World War II story in Colorado that just closed recently. But it's a fascinating story. It's a story of ingenuity, perseverance, innovation, breakthroughs, all that good stuff. And it's a great World War II tale and has some great lessons for us all as well. So the story of 10th Mountain doesn't actually start in the United States, technically. Depending on which version of the origin story you tell, it actually starts over in Europe in 1939. So September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. And later that month, the Soviet Union joins the fight as a fellow aggressor nation by invading Poland from the east. The Soviet Union then proceeds to roll through the Baltic states in pretty quick succession. Those states had only become independent about 20 years earlier, did not really have a lot of military might to stand against the Red Army, and so they fell pretty quickly. So then the Soviet Union set its sight on neighboring Finland, which was in a very similar situation. It gained independence from the Tsarist Empire about 20 years earlier, and they also expected this to be about a 2-week campaign, which might sound familiar. Instead, the Russians get bogged down for months by a really stiff, unexpectedly stiff Finnish resistance. The Finns had a fledgling military that they had invested in heavily after the Finnish Civil War of the 1920s. They had gained some mountain training, interestingly, from the German army in the First World War. And so they put up a pretty stiff resistance and made this Russian advance quite difficult. Here you can see some entrenchments that the Finns put up to capitalize on the winter season that the Russians quickly found themselves in. I should also note the picture on the right there. The Finns are the inventors of the Molotov cocktail. So this was an improvised anti-tank device. It was named for the Russian foreign minister who had lied to the Finns about Russian intentions earlier that year. So the relative strengths of the so-called Winter War, you had about 300,000 Finns, and that includes both the regular army and civil guard units, facing more than 500,000 invading Russian soldiers. The Finnish army had 32 tanks versus the invading Russians had between 2,500 and 6,500. We don't know exactly how many, but in other words, overwhelmingly more. And about 114 Finnish aircraft versus nearly 4,000 Soviet. So the odds were really not in the Finns' favor. But they had a few things going for them. They had the winter, as I mentioned. They had an army that was prepared to fight in that sort of environment. As you can see, they have camouflaging. They have insulated winter clothing, that sort of thing. And of course, they also had the advantage that their army hadn't just been purged by Stalin of any kind of low-level command and leadership. So the Finns put up an unexpected resistance and really became the darlings of the Western press. Here you can see a photo that circulated back then. Here's the Finnish ski troops that sort of became the darlings of this story because it was a very unconventional way to fight this war. But the Finnish ski troops, here you can see them using reindeer as pack animals. Were able to maneuver very quickly through the Finnish flatlands in this wintry environment. And they ended up becoming kind of symbols of this Finnish resistance. I mean, Finland was a democracy at the time, and so this was sort of a rallying cry for Western powers to somewhat ironically, considering that we later allied with the Soviet Union, but people rallied around the Finnish cause. Finnish ski soldiers even made their way over to the United States on fundraising drives. So ultimately, the Finns still technically lose the Winter War. They have to concede a whole bunch of factories. They had conceded some territory to the Soviets, but they maintain territorial independence in general. So that's a pretty remarkable victory against that overwhelming Soviet force. So watching this closely are all kinds of Western observers, and among them is this guy in the center, a guy named Charles Minnie Dole. So Minnie Dole was a Yale graduate. He was an insurance man. He was a Boy Scout where he had learned how to ski as a young kid. During the First World War, he was mobilized and he trained, but he never deployed to Europe. But he was really interested in recreational skiing. He himself had been injured pretty badly on a ski run in 1936, and that inspired him to found the National Ski Patrol in 1938. So he was the founding director of that organization. And as he was watching these newsreels and reading in the newspapers about these Finnish ski troops holding off the Soviets, he became inspired. And he thought, he knew that the U.S. Army had no such similar capability. And so he wrote the Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, and offered the help of the National Ski Patrol to recruit skiers for a would-be American ski and mountain force. So the way the traditional story goes is that Charles Minnie Dole came up with this grandiose idea, and he's basically the founder of the 10th Mountain Division. We've since learned that's not entirely correct. George C. Marshall, being as the Army Chief of Staff, being charged with modernizing and updating the Army in 1940. The lack of capability in mountain warfare he was well aware of this. So he was already looking into creating such a force. So it's more a matter of the National Ski Patrol's letter arriving at precisely the right time, when the Army was really interested in expanding its capabilities. So we have to see this birth of mountain warfare in the U.S. Army at the same time that we have the birth of airborne troops, combined arms warfare in general. Like as you can see, that's the picture on the right is from Louisiana maneuvers, testing out armored formations for the first time, that sort of thing. So it kind of fits part and parcel into this effort that George C. Marshall leads to expand the Army 40-fold in terms of personnel and really ramp up its capabilities. So for the first and only time in American history, you have a civilian organization, the National Ski Patrol, that is set up as an official recruiter on behalf of the U.S. Army. So they set up a new office in New York City, and they process incoming applications from recruits to join the ski troops. And the way this would work is you would either volunteer or be drafted. We had the first peacetime draft started in 1940. And as soon as you knew your induction date, you could write an application to the Ski Patrol to join the mountain troops, where they basically would go through regular basic training and then get transferred over. Interestingly, in the beginning, you can see in this vaguely worded telegram here that you would receive, or postcard that you would receive, there wasn't really a unit yet. It was sort of this abstract concept that you would just join the mountain troops, and they would kind of figure out as they went what this would look like. In the beginning, you had to supply, it was a pretty in-depth application. You had to test your outdoor skills. Things that qualified were skiing experience, climbing experience, if you were a Boy Scout, if you were a hunter, a trapper, even cowboys, that would be a qualification that would count. And you also had to receive 3 letters of recommendation. So the earliest recruits became known as the 3 lettermen because they had gotten their references that attested to their outdoor abilities. So the first cohort that they put together was about a battalion strength, or an under-strength battalion, more like company strength, but they were assembled as the 87th Mountain Infantry Battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington. And this was basically, Fort Lewis was a massive installation even at this time, and so they had the space for this kind of unit. They were close enough to Mount Rainier and other sort of mountainous environments that they could test out some of the equipment, test out some of the doctrine, and sort of figure out how does one even do mountain warfare. So the earliest approaches were for the officers in the division. Quite a few of them were, and I'll talk about that in a second, a lot of them were immigrants. They were able to read and then translate German and French and Italian mountaineering manuals. All of those armies already had mountain troops. And so basically it became a matter of seeing what everyone else in Europe was up to and testing out which approaches worked best, which equipment worked best, and then making that the official U.S. Army mountain program. So you can see a few soldiers already there in their winter whites and the ski equipment. But one of the major tasks too at Fort Lewis was to figure out what do you need in terms of procurement for mountain warfare. So what kind of equipment would you need to get this job done? And so they were testing for the first time things like Arctic sleeping bags that you see on the left there for sub-zero temperatures. You had moving equipment. I mean, not only staying still in mountainous environments and wintry environments is difficult, but moving things is even more so. So experimenting with different types of sleds or other ways to get equipment moved. You also have, and you'll get a chance after the talk to check out some of these artifacts as well, you have the mountain rucksack that is developed. And a quick word about that, I mean, rucksacks were not new to the Army certainly, but the priority had always been to cram as much stuff into a rucksack as possible. And then it turns out that if you have a normal Army rucksack, your center of gravity is way too high. If you try to ski or try to climb, that's pretty dangerous. So they need to innovate a new type of bag that lowered the center of gravity on a soldier's back. And so they came up with this basically very modern-looking A-frame design that continues to be used by hikers and mountaineers today. And so that became the mountain rucksack. You also had ski indicators developed to keep the ice and snow out of your places. And you had to develop a new kind of boot as well. So this is sort of what you see in the picture there. It's typical of a 1930s ski boot. Very square toe in the front that you would strap across, and then there's an indentation in the heel for the cable ski bindings. And that was further developed then into an all-purpose combat boot, so that you could wear it both for skiing and for mountaineering and for combat. There's one 10th Mountain vet who donated his boots to Colorado back in the day, and he accompanied it with a note that said, just like everything else, the Army designed to do two things, it did neither of them well. So he wasn't too pleased with those boots. They also tried a few things that didn't pan out. On the left here, you can see an early prototype of a snowmobile, and it's basically just a Harley engine strapped to a toboggan. And then they also tried moving things like the 1919 30 cal machine gun on tripods of skis. They sort of abandoned that as well. That didn't work as well as they hoped. So once the 87th figured out how do you do all this stuff and what do you need to get that job done, the Army was interested in expanding this unit to a full division strength. In order to do that, they needed to find a new home. They would not fit in Fort Lewis, and besides, that environment wasn't optimized for mountain training. And so they started looking around the country for other possible sites. The top contender was actually outside of Yellowstone National Park. They had to abandon that site because, well, in pre-war conditions, there were other priorities. And there's a rare crane that nests in that area of Yellowstone. And so for environmental reasons, they had to abandon that site because they couldn't disturb the cranes. So instead, they settled on a site further south in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, and that is the Pando Valley that you see here before construction of the camp. Pando Valley was known as Pando for the small town of Pando, and it really wasn't a town. It was really a train stop and a post office, basically. But it had a few advantages going for it. It sort of sits in a bowl, as you can see here, so you're kind of protected from the extreme winter winds. It had the requisite snowfall that the Army was looking for. You had gentle slopes for skiing, you had some steep cliff faces for climbing. Most critically, you had an existing rail line that ran through the valley, so getting soldiers and supplies up there was going to be possible. There was also a highway, an existing highway that they could expand to use for the summertime. So there were a lot of advantages to this location. There were a few disadvantages. Of course, when you have the requisite snowfall, that also presents certain challenges when it comes to construction and maintenance of a camp like this. And the other interesting one that the Army Corps 8th Corps report noted was that the social outlet for troops was lacking in the Colorado Rockies. So the closest town to Pando Valley is the town of Leadville. Sorry, just slipped my mind. Leadville. And Leadville, even today, sort of has a reputation as an old mining town. At the time, it had a very mixed reputation there. A lot of saloons, a lot of casinos, a lot of brothels, all the things that the Army did not want soldiers to have easy access to. But interestingly, the Army report then noted that this was less important for this particular camp because they figured that soldiers who were interested in becoming mountaineers wouldn't be interested in things like saloons and casinos and prostitutes. No. They would be taking advantage of the tremendous outdoor opportunities in the Colorado Rockies. So they decided to build it here after all. So they built it for a cost of about $30 million or $550 million today. It was the most expensive installation the Army built during World War II. They began construction in April 1942 and it lasted until November. And much like what's happening elsewhere, these are pretty cookie cutter sort of emplacements. All kind of standard buildings and standard layout for a triangular division. Even the construction units up at Camp Hale, they had competitions among themselves, who could construct the barracks the fastest. I believe the record was 8.5 hours for one of these barracks buildings. And here you have the headquarters sign once the camp opened. So a couple things to note here. So Camp Hale is a little hard to see in the picture, but there's some icicles hanging off the Camp Hale in the script. So they like to play on the wintry elements there. They were part of 7th Service Command. And on the right, you might see is a panda bear on skis. That was the original divisional emblem, or the closest thing to it. Someone in the camp newspaper drew this up, and that became sort of the unofficial logo of the troops while they were assembling up there. So here you can see Camp Hale in all of its glory. About 1,000 buildings, including various training buildings, and equipped to house, originally planned for 20,000, and then ultimately had to downsize slightly because of the valley, housed 15,000 soldiers and support personnel. Another unique feature of this otherwise rather standard camp are the buildings that you see in the front there. Those are mule stables. So the division also had room for 4,000 mules to live up there with them and train for the mule skinners. So you can see some of the division and the symbol right there. Then in July 1943, they finally had enough soldiers to actually formally activate the division. So originally the 87th Mountain Infantry Battalion that was Fort Lewis had been transferred over. It became the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment. They kept adding troops to it. Then they extracted experienced NCOs to form up a subsequent regiment and then another until finally they were at the requisite strength of about 13,500 soldiers for a light division structure. So they were activated on July 15th, 1943 as the 10th Light Division Alpine was their first designation. So the Army had been playing around with a light infantry divisional structure. They had raised 6 divisions in that sort of table of organization to see how it would work, and they ultimately decided to scrap the idea. They didn't want to they wanted to go with full strength infantry divisions for deployment in both Europe and Pacific. The only one they kept the light infantry structure for was the 10th, because they saw advantages in terms of mobility in mountainous environments, and so they kept it as a light structure here. You'll notice if you're familiar with modern 10th, you might think there's something missing on that patch. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment too. There was no mountain tab when they were first activated in 1943. Another fun thing to note here, I mentioned the Pando Commando. That was the sort of unofficial emblem of the division. The Army Heraldry Office turned that design down. It was formally submitted, and they said, nope, that's too cartoony. And so they designed this instead. And of course, lots of allusions to infantry. So you have, the powder keg shape of the patch. You have the cross bayonets. You have blue. All the things alluding to infantry. And then, of course, the cross bayonets form the Roman numeral 10 for 10th Infantry at the time. The 10th weren't the only guys up at Camp Hale, so I'll say something real quick about these folks, and certainly at the end of the talk we have some time for Q&A. You can ask some more about these stories too. One of the other units up there was the 620th Engineer General Service Company, which is sort of a very innocuous description for this unit. And really what they were, and that was very intentionally innocuous, what they were soldiers the Army couldn't trust. So the draft obviously didn't just scoop up, good red-blooded patriotic Americans during World War II. There were lots of other elements as well. And in particular, they were concerned about some German sympathizers that were caught up in the draft. And these were people who they hadn't actually committed any crimes or done anything egregious enough to exempt them from military service. But nevertheless, the Army was concerned about, trusting these soldiers. And so specifically in these units that they assembled them in, and there were 3 of these companies, they were not authorized to carry firearms. They were not even trained to shoot. So they were not trusted. They were kind of given menial labor tasks, and the idea was to keep them far away from the front lines and out of trouble. And so the 620th spent some time up at Camp Hale, and trouble still they found. The guy in the center that's circled there is a guy named Dale Maple. Dale Maple had been the valedictorian of his high school class. He went on to Harvard, did ROTC there, or started ROTC there, and he got kicked out of Harvard's German club and his ROTC unit because he was singing Nazi songs at the meetings. So for whatever reason, he had never been to Germany. He became fascinated by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, was very open about his support, and so when he was ultimately drafted, they put him into one of these units. But up at Camp Hale, so not only was the 10th there and the 620th, there was also a small complement of German POWs. This was fairly common practice, as they were coming over from Africa especially. In 1943, they would ship them over to the United States and set them up at various military installations where they would, again, perform sort of menial tasks around camp. Many of them were employed in the civilian sphere in agriculture and that sort of thing. But there were about 200 African Corps veterans up at Camp Hale as well. And Dale Maple used his German knowledge to befriend a few of them. And then he hatched a plan with a couple of these Africa Corps guys, and he stole some civilian clothes, he stole a car, and the three of them drove all the way to Mexico before they were caught. And the Mexican police turned them over to the Texas Rangers, figuring they had come from Texas, and the Texas Rangers were really surprised to find not only that they had come all the way from Colorado, but that one of them was a uniformed American soldier. So this was a huge scandal when this broke the news. Dale Maple was initially sentenced to death for a crime equivalent to treason. Ended up spending some time here at Leavenworth. And then ultimately, after the war ended, no one really cared anymore, and his sentence was commuted and sort of faded into obscurity. And then another unit that was up at Camp Hale is the one on the right. That's the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate. So this was another Army experiment at the time, was these separate infantry battalions that they were setting up of first-generation foreign immigrants that they thought they might deploy in sort of special operations tasks. The 99th was comprised entirely of Norwegian Americans, and a lot of first-generation Norwegians. And the plan initially was to basically, insert them clandestinely into Norway and sort of help stage an uprising against German occupation. That didn't end up happening. They still saw some action in Europe then, but the 99th spent some time at Camp Hale to learn how to do mountain warfare before they shifted over to that other role. There were also about 200 women up at Camp Hale. So women serving in the Women's Army Corps, so an all-volunteer force that basically did every possible job on post that didn't involve actively firing a weapon. So without the Women's Army Corps, none of these installations could have run. They operated the telephone offices, the motor pool, even the armorers, a lot of them were from the Women's Army Corps. So they performed a multitude of tasks up there. Then the first actual combat deployment that you have for anyone from Camp Hale is not over in Europe, but it's over in the Bering Sea. So there's a little known operation called Operation Cottage that a part of 10th Mountain gets sent off to participate in. So as you may or may not know, the two westernmost Aleutian Islands were captured by the Japanese during World War II. It's the only American territory, or proper territory that was captured and occupied by Imperial Japan. The island of Attu, the westernmost island, was recaptured in May 1943 by about 15,000 American soldiers, who took about 23% casualties, taking the island back from 2,000 Japanese defenders. Of those 2,000 Japanese defenders, 28 surrendered and the rest fought to the death. So that gives you some sense of the intensity of the fighting on Attu. And so when it came to preparations for Kiska, the Army figured they had learned their lesson. Also, about half the Army casualties were just from frostbite, right? So there's inexperience of working in this kind of environment. And so they figured for the next island, they were going to more than double the invasion force, they're going to more than double the preparatory bombardments, and they would be sure to include mountain experienced or mountain trained soldiers in the operation. And so they took the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment from Camp Hale, detached them from the 10th Division that was being formed, and sent them out to the Bering Sea. Ultimately, what's interesting, the Japanese also learned a lesson on Attu, and they decided to secretly evacuate the island about 2 weeks before the Allies landed. So they left things looking, they abandoned tons of equipment to make it look like the Japanese were still on the island. They booby-trapped tons of stuff, they laid lots of mines. And tragically, the Aleutians are well known for their fog, really dense fog that will enshroud these islands. And so when a combined American and Canadian force landed on August 15th, 1943, they're all jittery. They had heard the stories about Attu, and when they saw each other in the shrouded fog, there were tons of friendly fire incidents. So there were ultimately 500 casualties taken on Kiska just from booby traps, landmines, and friendly fire incidents. 17 men of the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment were killed on Kiska as part of this operation. But thankfully, they had expected far higher casualties, of course, if an enemy had actually been present. So the 87th was actually expected to take more or less 100% casualties. They figured they would be combat ineffective after this operation. Instead, they were sent back to Camp Hale. They were reintegrated into the 10th Division and became part of future 10th Mountain. So a lot of guys at Camp Hale were getting frustrated, though. So they were in this special unit that they had, in many cases, specially applied for. They were excited to do their part for the war effort, and yet they were stuck in the Colorado Rockies, training away on skis and with climbing pitons and hammers. And they were eager to get in the fight. And the Army was hesitant to deploy them, and there's a few reasons for that. So one is this experiment with light division structure that sort of delayed things a little bit as they were testing that out. And the other was really an opportunity cost problem. You have one single mountain division, and you have 3 major theaters of operation, all of which theoretically they could be sent to and would have applicable roles for. And so the Army was hesitant to deploy them in any particular place and sort of commit them to one area, when then it turns out they would actually be more badly needed elsewhere. So let's talk real quick about the makeup here. So, I mentioned the 3 lettermen that were the initial recruits for this unit, right? So highly motivated, most of the time highly educated soldiers as well. Skiing and climbing were pretty expensive sports in the 1930s and 40s. So by and large, you were drafted, or you were recruiting folks from basically Ivy League programs, right? So basically the whole Dartmouth ski team signed up together to join the mountain troops. Their coach even signed up to join as well. But by the end of 1942, early 1943, you've pretty much run out of your pool of qualified skiers and climbers out there, and the Army had to look beyond that set of qualifications. And so you started seeing draftees get sent to Camp Hale to fill in the ranks. So ultimately, there were more draftees serving in 10th Mountain than experienced Mountaineers. There's a few exemplary cases. There's one family who's really active 10th Mountain descendants and all that stuff. And so there was a guy, their grandfather was Cruz Rios. He was from California, was a miner, dropped out of high school, had never seen mountains, had never climbed, had never skied, and then finds himself assigned to the ski troops after basic training. They basically counted off at his company, and every 3rd guy went to Camp Hale. So that's how that unit was constituted. The other interesting fact about the makeup of the division is that you had an unusually high percentage of first-generation immigrants. And this again was due to sort of Army administrators doing their thing and trying to guide people to the right units. And so, for example, they figured that if any immigrant being drafted had country of origin as Austria, well, Austria, of course, it's an alpine country. Everyone from Austria obviously knows how to ski, so they sent them straight off to Camp Hale. And that's how about 200 Austrians ended up up there. Quite a few Germans as well, some Swedes, some Norwegians. Interestingly, about the 200 Austrians, there's an Austrian researcher who's looked into them. 70% of them were Jews fleeing persecution from Vienna. They had never skied, they had never been in the Alps, but nevertheless found themselves at Camp Hale doing mountain training. But so the Army was undecided on what to do with these guys. And in the meantime, we had the Normandy landings. Things were really getting kicked up a notch, and the Army was taking considerable casualties. I mean, at much higher rates than ever before in World War II. And so the Army decided that ultimately the mountain experiment had been a failure, that these skills wouldn't be applicable to the environment after all. What they really needed was boots on the ground. And so they transferred the 10th Light Division down to Camp Swift, Texas, to undergo flatman training, and they were going to be broken up and used as replacements for losses taken in Europe. This was a time of incredibly low morale for the division. I mean, they were going from the Colorado Rocky High Country down to the summer of Texas outside of Camp Swift. So all the letters complain about these conditions. Quite a few of them put in for transfers at this point and just sort of want to get ahead of this, being sent off as replacements. But the Army ends up changing its mind yet again shortly after they get to Camp Swift. Because it turns out there was one particular place that was giving the Army a big old headache and that they needed some specialized troops for, and the 10th Mountain Division was just absolutely perfectly suited for this challenge. And that was in Italy. Excuse me. So Italy is sort of the forgotten theater of World War II. We tend to focus most on Northern Europe and next most on the Pacific, and Italy is sort of that forgotten stepchild of World War II history. And at the time, commanders in Italy commented on this as well, that they were left out of the headlines back home, that a lot of families didn't understand why their sons were in Italy because it was never featured heavily. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, first of all, it's the soft underbelly of Europe. They were hoping to take Italy out of the war pretty quickly and then advance into southern Germany. And that plan worked in the beginning, right? I mean, the Sicily landings, pretty costly operation, near failure, but was a success ultimately. Shortly after landing in Italy, Mussolini gets ousted, and Italy officially switches sides. So there was some progress being made. By June 1944, right around the Normandy landings, General Mark Clark rolls into Rome, right? Liberates the first Axis capital. So it seems like these should all be attention-grabbing headlines that would motivate people to pay more attention to Italy. But shortly after the liberation of Rome, the whole thing grinds to a halt. And that is because the Allies run into the Apennine Mountains that run down into central Italy, and the Germans have a tremendously advantageous position holding these mountain positions against the Allied force. So the Allied offensive grinds to a halt against the sides of these slopes, even though they greatly outnumber their German opponents. They have total air superiority at this point. The Luftwaffe is basically non-existent in Italy in 1944. And yet they get caught up in these mountains. And so even though Mark Clark had been told not to expect any new divisions, and even replacements were hard to get for him in Italy because there was more focus on what was happening in France and in Belgium, In November 1944, he was told, you're going to get a specialized mountain division, and that's the 10th Mountain. And so they kind of reversed course again and shipped them out from Camp Swift over to the East Coast, where they embarked on various ships to make their way across to Naples and join the fight in Italy. So here we have the table of organization for what is, in November 1944, renamed officially the 10th Mountain Division. And this is also when, remember I mentioned before the patch, right? This is when they gained the Mountain Tab, on November 6, 1944. So here you can see the table of organization for that moment. So 13,500 soldiers make up the division. As to be expected, most of them are in the infantry regiments that you see there, the mountain infantry. You have 3 field artillery battalions that had been training on light 75mm pack howitzers and then were upgunned to 105s before heading over, or most of them were, before heading over to Italy. The only other kind of thing to set the division apart is they had a mountain cavalry reconnaissance troop that went over with them as well, so about 200 guys on horses. So for the commanders over in Italy, so you have Mark Clark on the left there, sort of a controversial commander. He had a reputation for being very ambitious. He had made quite a few enemies in the Army command structure. At the same time, he was a very close friend of David Eisenhower, so that, or Dwight David Eisenhower, so that helped him out quite a bit in his career as well. And then 10th Mountain itself got a new commander right before heading over to Europe. Their existing commander, Lloyd Jones, officially the word is that he fell ill and had to be replaced, but from some correspondence that we found, the Army sort of lost trust in his ability to lead the division overseas. He had overseen the transfer to Camp Swift, had also been very unhappy about that move, and had apparently let it be known. And he also did not have combat experience that the Army was looking for this position. Whereas the guy on the right who ends up replacing him, George Price Hayes, he was a World War I veteran. He actually was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War I, working with an artillery unit. He had 7 horses shot out from under him in an engagement there. By World War II, he had commanded artillery at Normandy, so he had some very recent, very relevant combat experience as far as the Army was concerned. So they sent him back stateside to introduce him to his staff, and then he made his way over to Italy, where he met the rest of the division. On the German side, the overall theater commander was Albert Kesselring, the guy in the center there. He was a Luftwaffe officer, but he oversaw the entire Italian defense. He was a very experienced combat leader. He had served on every single front of the war up to this point. He was also very pragmatic about his role in Italy. So other commanders might have been jealously guarding their resources. Kesselring actually offered to transfer more of his divisions out of Italy, insisting that he could do the defense with fewer forces so that those units could be used back for the defense of Germany proper. So pretty pragmatic guy, focused very much on doing the most with less that he could. Sort of came up with various defensive depth ideas and tank choke points and things like that. Used landmines very effectively, and so staged a very stiff defense of the Italian peninsula. So he's on the German side. Interesting to note too, for the longest time, the German divisions that are holding off the Allies in Italy have very high divisional numbers. And for the longest time after the war, it was assumed, well, those were late war units, just cobbled together from the latest recruits, so they were inferior quality. That was the official Army assessments. These were inferior troops that the Allies were facing. Not so. Since then, we've sort of dug into the German side a little bit more. Yes, they had high divisional numbers. Yes, those divisions had recently been constituted, but very intentionally borrowing experienced, especially NCOs, from other infantry divisions and outfits. So they were actually facing some very combat-hardened troops in Italy, despite their high divisional numbers. So for a snapshot of the orders of battle here in February 1945, when the 10th Mountain Division hits the front line, this is what it's looking like. So 15th Army Group on the Allied side is commanded by Mark Clark, and you have the U.S. 5th Army and the British 8th Army under his command. So 10th Mountain is one of the, well, it's very hard to read, but they're one of those little lines there to the right-hand side of that side of the chart. On the German side, so that's about a million Allied boots on the ground. On the Axis side, you have about 600,000 defenders, including primarily German divisions. There's a few Mussolini loyalists that are still in the fight as well. Interesting to note, on the German side, there's also only one single mountain division. And that surprises people sometimes because of that mountainous environment. But of course, if you're the one defending the heights and you have the advantageous slopes up them, I mean, you can send regular infantry units up there to hold bunkers and hold positions. That's simple enough, but assaulting mountains is what you really need that expertise for, and that's why the Allies have been struggling. So the first objective they had was Mount Belvedere, that's off to the right of this picture. So Mount Belvedere was a pretty unremarkable height along Highway 64 that happened to be a supply route through the Apennines. But it controlled that highway, and it controlled a lot of the other heights around it. So that sort of became the Allied objective in the fall of 1944. Forces from U.S. Fifth Army had tried 3 times unsuccessfully to take Mount Belvedere. So by the time 10th Mountain hit the front lines, the plan was basically attack that same mountain again, right? But very quickly, I mean, George Hayes insisted that he and his staff wanted to take a look at the environment themselves and sort of figure out, I mean, do we just follow the same attack plan again, or do we try something new? And he quickly discovered that actually key to capturing Belvedere was this ridge that ran to the west. And the reason for that, I mean, it's a very steep cliff face there. It's a little bit difficult to tell in the picture, but that's quite a bit of elevation change there. So that was basically considered impassable terrain by both sides. But on top of that ridge, that had much gentler slopes on the other side, were a bunch of German artillery observation bunkers. And this has perfect sight lines on the advances to Mount Belvedere. So basically every single time the Allies had launched an attack, German observers on top of what later became known as Riva Ridge could see that advance and call in incredibly accurate and deadly fire onto those advancing troops. So George Hayes figured with his expert mountaineers, the real objective was capturing Riva Ridge first, blinding those observation posts, and then you could follow up with an attack on Belvedere. And so that's the plan they set into motion. So here you can see the map overlay for this engagement. So on the left side, you have Riva Ridge, and on the right, or kind of in the center, you have Belvedere. And so he split up the division, 1st Battalion, 86th, and one single company from 2nd Battalion, F Company, make their way up Riva Ridge. It's a nighttime climb that they do, which is pretty remarkable. So they sent their expert climbers up first to kind of figure out the routes. They identify 5 possible routes, then they reduced it to 4 the morning of because one route was too icy. But so they climb in the dead of night up the side of this steep cliff face in the middle of February 1945. They're also told, I mean, they're not supposed to fire their weapons at the enemy because it will give away, the muzzle flashes will give away their position. So they have to take the top of Riva Ridge with bayonets and hand grenades only. And one guy with a bow and arrow, that's kind of a cool story. But so they are wildly successful. They managed to take out the German defenses on top of Riva Ridge. They blind those observation bunkers, and the men of the 86th pulled off 7 counterattacks on the top of the ridge over the next couple days. Immediately the following day, after they captured the top of the ridge and have blinded those observation posts, the rest of the division launches the attack on Mount Belvedere, which is also successful. They continue working their way across the ridge there to Monte della Torraccia on the right. Fun little story as well. I can get more into that in the Q&A, but it's also the first and only use of a combat aerial tramway on the advance to Riva Ridge. The climb itself takes about 3 hours, and so especially once you start taking casualties, that's a big problem, trying to get people off the ridge and also get supplies back up. And so there's one particular company of engineers attached to 10th Mountain that had trained with this system in Colorado and ran up a tramway that turned a 3-hour climb into a 3-minute cable ride. And so that clearly, I mean, that hugely contributed to holding the ridge and to evacuating wounded. Here's the top of Mount Belvedere after it was successfully taken by 10th Mountain, and here in the background you can see that's Riva Ridge. So I think this shot really more than most others illustrates that point. I mean, what kind of advantage the observation posts on Riva Ridge had. I should also note, all of these photographs come from that historic 10th Mountain Division collection. We have thousands of photographs of them in training. And then, of course, the Army told them there was a strict prohibition of cameras in Italy. So, of course, we have thousands of pictures taken in Italy by soldiers with cameras they weren't supposed to have. And so all of those are in our archives now as well. So after they managed to take and hold Belvedere, that sort of punches a hole in the German defensive line. They have to retreat to the next set of defenses, and it gets some movement back into the Allied campaign. It's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. And for this theater that sort of most commanders have written off, I mean, this is pretty remarkable. So 10th Mountain gets called out in all kinds of dispatches, all the way up to the overall commander of the Mediterranean Theater, Sir Harold Alexander, calls them out for their exemplary service. In March 1945, I mean, 10th Mountain now is eager to stay in the fight, right? They have the Germans on the run, they believe, they just want to keep pushing. And basically, 5th Army tells them to slow down. The rest of the 5th Army needs to catch up to their various staging points because there's a bigger plan in motion to punch out of the Apennine Mountains, and 10th Mountain is just a little bit too eager, so they slow them down a little bit. So the March Offensive, as it becomes known, It's another limited objective attack just to capture some staging areas, and then 10th Mountain has to stay put in those areas for about 5 weeks before they can launch, or 4 weeks I guess it is, before they launch the next offensive. And so on the one hand, very remarkable, they achieve their objectives so quickly that then they just have to dig in and wait. On the other hand, that gives the Germans opposing them those same 4 weeks to prepare defenses for the assault that they know is coming. And so that's going to have some pretty deadly consequences. So in April 1945, the Allies are getting ready for a push across the entirety of the Italian peninsula known as Operation Grapeshot. And the idea is to really push out of the Apennine Mountains once and for all and into the open Po River Valley and get the Germans on the run. As part of this preparation, 10th Mountain here, you can see one of their field artillery battalions shelling the sides of the German defenses. But there's a number of things that go wrong that morning that or for this attack, the launch of this attack. First of all, they're delayed for 2 days because of weather. They have some supporting aircraft they want to bring in, and there's just too much fog early in the morning that they're not able to take off. And so the whole operation on the 5th Army side is delayed by a couple days. Then the morning that they actually want to launch it, April 14th, they're holding off because there's fog again, and then finally they decide to hit go at about 9 a.m. It's a few hours later than they were initially hoping. And so you have, rather than an assault being started at dawn, right, sort of surprise the Germans right in the morning, you have it started mid-morning by the time the infantry hits the ground. And so you have the sun is fully up, they're fully visible, and so that will have some ramifications as well. Here you can see kind of the look from 10th Mountain staging areas towards their new objectives across the valley and where the German positions are. But of course, tragically, these are the sides that you can see. This is what the aircraft can hit, this is what your field artillery battalions can chew up. But German defensive mountain doctrine tells you that you defend on the reverse slope of the mountain, and you wait for the assault to come in, and then you counterattack to the front face. So all of this artillery being lobbed over there was unfortunately pretty ineffective in terms of softening up the German defenses. And so when 10th Mountain hits the ground that morning and makes their way across the valley, it is the deadliest day in 10th Mountain history. They get chewed up pretty badly from machine gun emplacements, from mortars that had plenty of time to sight in those weeks beforehand. Tens of thousands of landmines have been laying in that valley as well, and it's an incredibly deadly engagement. Usually when I'm speaking to younger audiences, I don't even bother mentioning Bob Dole because they have no idea who that is. But Bob Dole was a replacement officer for 10th Mountain in Italy, and he was a platoon leader leading his rifle platoon across this very valley when he was hit by either mortar shrapnel or machine gun fire. I'm not entirely sure, but tore up his back completely. He was left for dead initially. A medic found him, gave him some morphine, and put his big letter M on his forehead in his own blood to let the next medic know he had already gotten a dose, basically to ease his passing. But miraculously, he survived. It took a decade of physical therapy and dozens of operations. And as you might remember, Bob Dole for the rest of his life carried the wounds from World War II. He was incredibly stiff. He couldn't use his right arm. All of that was from wounds sustained serving as an officer for 10th Mountain. So here you can see the spring offensive, Operation Grapeshot, and the effect that it has to push out of those Apennine Mountains and into the Po River Valley. So 10th Mountain has spent, indicated here, right, most of their campaign right here, and then in a matter of weeks, they're pushing through the rest of the Italian peninsula. Things are really sped up quite a bit at this point. There are no defensive lines in the Po River Valley. The Germans are just hightailing it out of there as fast as they can. 10th Mountain moves so quickly that its officers are actually running off of the maps that they're issued. They can't issue them fast enough to keep up with the movement. 10th Mountain is the first Allied unit to reach the Po River. They're also the first to cross it against orders. They were told to hold on the southern bank, but Hayes saw an opportunity to keep pressing, and so under fire they managed to cross the river and just keep going. Here's the advance in the Po River Valley. And then here's the pontoon bridge that the division constructs to get the rest of the division across after the initial boats. Their final objective is up in northern Italy, and it's at Lake Garda. Lake Garda now, a beautiful resort town. People love to vacation there. It's an alpine lake, incredibly deep as well. And on either side of the lake, you have roads that run through a series of tunnels through these Dolomite Mountains that really just descend into the lake itself. The Germans use those as sort of defensive choke points. Tunnel number 4 in particular gets known as the Tunnel of Death, because not only do a bunch of retreating Germans die in there when an explosive accidentally gets set off, but a German artillery shell lands in there just as a company of 10th Mountain makes their way through it and exacts a huge toll in terms of casualties. There's also sort of And another unfortunate incident that happens at Lake Garda, 10th Mountain experiences the single largest MIA case in U.S. Army history that is not ocean-fared. So as part of this operation, because of those tunnels that are closed off, they decide to send some of the elements across the lake itself in these duck transports that you see here. And during a nighttime crossing on one of these ducks, they overloaded with equipment, and they're pretty choppy seas at this point, or choppy lake. One of the ducks goes down, and in the pitch black, the soldiers can't figure out which way to go. All but one drowned in that lake and have been MIA ever since. The duck itself was actually found within the last 10 years by a robot diver. And now when the descendants make their journey back there, they actually take a boat out to the spot where the duck is in the bottom of the lake and lay a wreath in memory of these 25 lost guys. And things in Italy take another interesting turn. So they're chasing them across the Po River Valley. They're reaching the southern Dolomites. So 10th Mountain is bracing for another mountain campaign basically down there. But behind the scenes, something else is happening. The guy on the left there is Alan Dulles. Alan Dulles, who had been a diplomat before the war, and then during the war became very active with OSS. After the war, he becomes the founding director of the CIA. And he used his diplomatic contacts to get in touch with the highest ranking possible German he could find in Italy to talk about peace terms. So the guy that he manages to get in contact with through Swiss contacts is the guy on the right, an SS general by the name of Karl Wolff. And the two of them start hashing out in March 1945 what an early surrender in Italy might look like. And Wolff sort of strings him along for a while until Hitler commits suicide, and all of a sudden he's happy to sign some papers. So on May 2nd, 1945, they agree to a wholesale capitulation of German forces in Italy. So this is a full week before it happens in the rest of Europe. So that's pretty remarkable. But the other interesting thing about this episode is that Alan Dulles in no way was authorized to negotiate this surrender. So he very much did this on his own authority. The Soviets in particular were very dismayed by this. The Allies had very specifically agreed not to sign any separate peace agreements with the Germans. And so Stalin was worried that Roosevelt was trying to trick him. But so the fighting stops on May 2nd. Interesting to note too for Karl Wolff, he wrote himself a little personal exemption into the negotiations. He would be exempt, as the German representative, from any post-war war crimes trials. Well, SS General Karl Wolff had been up to a few bad things during World War II, especially in Italy with killing civilians, reprisal actions, that sort of thing, that he was never tried for by Allied military authorities. Eventually, the law still catches up to him when German civilian courts in the 1960s try him for war crimes. Here's the announcement in the divisional newspaper, the Blizzard, that the war is finally over for them. And 10th Mountain spends the rest of its time in Italy rounding up and processing German POWs, more or less. There's a little episode where the division gets sent off to northeastern Italy as a blocking force against Yugoslav partisans. They were worried about Tito and his communists trying to do a land grab at Italy. So 10th Mountain holds them off. That's kind of their last formal role. But a lot of this time is spent, sort of relaxing, recuperating, seeing the sights. We have tons of pictures of soldiers going to Rome, to Pisa, posing with the tower, that sort of thing. Here they are celebrating 4th of July with a pie eating contest. But at the same time, you have something else that's obviously looming in all of their minds, is that the war in Italy might be over, but it's raging elsewhere still. And so in the summer of 1945, 10th Mountain loads up on boats again to make their way across the Atlantic because they've been picked as one of the divisions for the so-called Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. And they're on their transports on the Atlantic when the 2 atomic bombs are dropped and they hear that the war is formally over. So you might be familiar with the points system from World War II in terms of how soldiers managed to kind of earn their way back home, that they had to have performed certain occupation duties and then whatever else until they had enough points. Well, 10th Mountain sort of skirted that by being on the transports already on their way back. So they get received back on the East Coast at various ports. They make their way back to Camp Carson, Colorado. They have some furlough, and then they're formally inactivated in November 1945. Sort of ahead of the schedule of a lot of the other guys. So what happens to Camp Hale, their beautiful Colorado home? Well, as soon as the division transferred to Camp Swift in the fall of 1944, the Army started tearing the place down. So why, right? It's the most expensive installation that you've ever built. It's too expensive to maintain when you don't have a division up there. So literally the personnel needed to run across all the various buildings to keep the pipes from freezing in the winter was too expensive to justify. And so they started scrapping the place and just keeping a small cluster of buildings to be used as a mountain warfare center operated from nearby Camp Carson. When that was wound down in the late 50s, they transferred the property to the CIA. The CIA used it to train Tibetan guerrillas in the 1960s. Sort of a little known episode. There's a little plaque up there now to commemorate that role. Interesting too, the CIA at the time circulated newspaper stories in Colorado that they were doing nuclear testing at the site just to keep people away from there, and that was pretty effective. Then in 1968, or by 1968, they had torn down all the rest of the buildings, and the whole property was formally transferred to the U.S. Forest Service, and that's who still administers it today. There were an awful lot of cleanup operations on exploded ordnance all over the place, and even to this day. There was just a case last year where they found a training mine while hiking. Someone found one. Also, all of these buildings were insulated with asbestos back in the day. So there were, even in the summertime, what looked to be snow on the ground was actually just clumps of asbestos that the Army had to clean up for many decades. Just a couple of years ago, President Biden flew out there and they had a big ceremony because it was designated as a National Historic Landmark. And so Camp Hale now is protected from, or has that protected status going forward. It's a very popular site for, you can go snowshoeing up there, or four-wheeling, or snowmobiling, and even some climbing you can still do on the old training cliff faces that 10th Mountain used. In fact, Colorado National Guard still goes up there to train on those same cliff faces. 10th Mountain story, of course, will be familiar to many in the room here, but so they were formally inactivated in 1945. They make it back into the roster in 1950 for the Korean War, but as the 10th Infantry Division stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas. And they basically are just a training division churning through over 100,000 soldiers, getting them ready for deployment in Korea. Then in the mid-1950s, they get sent over to Germany as part of the kind of Fulda Gap operations there. And then they're inactivated again until 1985 when the Army resurrects them for the Table Organization. So in 1985, it was going to come back as the 10th Infantry Division. And when 10th Mountain, World War II 10th Mountain vets heard about this, they wrote their good old friend Bob Dole, that you see him right there, and asked him to intervene. Isn't there something he could do to make sure that they actually carry the World War II legacy? And so he set some things in motion very quickly to make sure that in 1985, when it was reactivated Fort Drum, they would not only carry the mountain tab, but also the mountain name in honor of that World War II generation. And then, of course, during the Global War on Terror, 10th Mountain becomes the single most deployed division in the U.S. Army. Beyond the military influence, I'll wrap up with kind of the recreational influence, right? So a lot of this was born out of those innovations in recreational skiing and climbing that were made in the 30s and 40s, and that's where all that expertise was being drawn from when they first constituted the division. And you have that same influence going back into the civilian sphere at the end of World War II. I mean, so not only do you have all of these trained skiers and climbers going back into the civilian world and founding places like Aspen, Whiteface, pretty much every ski resort across the country has a 10th Mountain connection. But on top of that, you have all of their old gear hitting the surplus market. So all of a sudden in the 1960s, when you can buy a pair of ski mountain boots for 50 cents, and you can buy ski poles for 50 cents, and a pair of skis for $1, you've democratized skiing, right? You've taken this incredibly expensive elite sport and made it broadly available to the masses. So this contributed hugely to getting Americans into skiing in the 1960s and 70s and really solidifying its place in recreational culture here. So that's our story of 10th Mountain Division. I thank you so much for listening, and I'm open to any questions that you might have. Yes?
And the guard at Lake there, the guard at sea, as they say, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's where William Darby was killed.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So William Darby, who had more than done his part for World War II at this point, volunteered to become the assistant division commander of 10th Mountain. He was looking for a frontline assignment again. He had been brought back stateside. And so for the last couple of weeks in April 1945, he was the assistant division commander. He led Task Force Darby as part of the push through the Po River Valley. And then, in the town of Torbole on Lake Garda, it was a single shot of artillery, probably just a ranging shot from the Germans. They could have had no idea who was on the receiving end. But it lands in the middle of him and then a couple of his officers conferring, and he's killed. Yeah. April 30th, I want to say. So right at the end.
Well, you said you had a few other kind of neat little stories you had tucked away. Any particular one you want to share? Or?
Well, with the immigrant story, that's sort of a fun one. People are often surprised to learn that a division destined for Europe, ultimately, that's sort of primarily the focus, that you would want a whole bunch of German speakers in there. But that doesn't seem to have been a problem for anyone. These first-generation immigrants that were coming over and doing their army service, I found no evidence that any of them hesitated shooting at who might be their former neighbors or classmates, right? So that didn't end up being a concern. But among some of those immigrants, interestingly, were the Von Trapp family, right? So the Von Trapp family singers make their way from Austria to Switzerland and over to the United States. They set up their lodge in Vermont, and two of those kids that you see in the musical grow up to be the right age for drafting into World War II, and they end up serving in 10th Mountain. And sort of on a related note, I kind of alluded to this, a lot of the early three lettermen were Ivy League guys, right? So the division early on sort of had a Playboy division reputation for having so many college kids. In fact, 70% of the division qualified for OCS, which is way above average for Army units at the time. So this presents interesting challenges for command as well, because you have all these relatively highly educated guys that now are listening to some second lieutenant, right? So there theoretically was some issue there. You also had, especially the 87th Mountain Infantry Battalion, when they first put that together, you had career Army guys in charge of people who knew way more about skiing and climbing than they ever would. And so you had these privates teaching officers how to conduct mountain warfare. So sort of an interesting reversal of roles. But part of what they managed to negotiate for 10th Mountain too, because of those specialized skill sets, ordinarily, if you qualified for OCS and you successfully applied for it, they would, you would go do your training, they would reassign you to a totally different unit. Because the idea was that, of course, the guys that you had just served with wouldn't respect you as an officer now, as a returning officer. They made an exception for 10th Mountain because they argued successfully that actually it was hugely advantageous to have guys come back after OCS who had all that experience skiing and climbing to lead those men more effectively.
Could you expand on the transfer from Camp Yale to Camp Swift? Because from my understanding and reading all Mountain history as well, one of the things that disgruntled the soldiers is when they went to Camp Swift and went on to Italy, a lot of things they experimented with, they developed, they refined, they didn't take to Italy.
Yes, absolutely, yes. The equipment, that was a big part of the problem too. So in addition to kind of having reduced morale because of their potentially changed role and being sent out as replacements, a whole bunch of their equipment basically got lost in Army administration. So by the time they got over to Italy, a very small fraction of their equipment actually made it over. So when you're talking about the skis and the climbing equipment, the weasels they had developed, so that's a mechanized vehicle for mountain environments, even their mules didn't make it to Italy. So instead they had to find creative ways around this. One of the early kind of strokes of luck they had is they liberated a German Army depot that happened to be a mountain depot. And so it was filled with crampons and pitons and piton hammers and ice axes. And so a lot of the assaulting troops on Reaper Ridge were doing this with captured German equipment. And same with skis. The early kind of ski patrols that they did on the front lines in Italy were done on captured German skis. And similarly for the mules, they found ways to requisition local Italian mules or horses to assist with those tasks. But yes, absolutely, that was hugely impactful.
I think another amazing thing too, I'm not sure how much you know about this, is when you have modern day skiers that go back to Italy and try to replicate some of the things that they did with like those skis that you had on the earlier picture of the boots, they can't do it. I mean, in terms of speed, in terms of skill they have developed, that just really tells you how truly professional and well skilled those skiers were back then. Because modern skiers have a hard time trying to equate to some of that same skill, even with better equipment.
Yeah, absolutely, that's true. The equipment at the time, they were using standard civilian gear in obviously a much more hazardous environment. And the Kandahar cable ski bindings, the troops training with them nicknamed them the bear traps because they wouldn't let go of your boot if you fell. So you had an awful lot of broken ankles, broken legs in training, and then on deployment as well. When if you happen to take a tumble, those skis would tumble with you rather than snapping off as the later designs would.
You mentioned the tent got deactivated after World War II. Was there an institutional hub that held on to that knowledge base, or did a lot of that kind of leave the Army and they had to rebuild it later?
That's a great question. And actually, there's a book that just came out about this by Lance Blythe, a good friend of mine who looked into this in detail. I think his is the first book that really looked into this in detail. Most of the knowledge is sort of lost, right? So as the Army demobilizes, and this is common across, every Army and every conflict, when you demobilize, you lose an awful lot of institutional knowledge. They do try to hold on to it with that Mountain Warfare Center in Camp Carson. So there's a few of those 10th Mountain vets that end up manning that school. And then some of that knowledge gets transferred. I mean, when the Army closes that down, they transfer it to the Winter Warfare Center up in Alaska. And that sort of becomes the sole place where that sort of training is taking place. But yeah, in general, a whole lot of that knowledge, unfortunately, is lost, as is common. Yeah, questions?
So the seeds for any of this, none of it really traced to World War I. You didn't have guerrillas like doing a biathlon where they were skiing and shooting, and just giving the ideas for the need of this in future warfare.
Great question. Yeah. So World War I actually is an important part of this origin story. So not specifically for the American mountain troops, but for military mountaineering, absolutely. So it's the first conflict where you have organized mountain troops on both sides. They're doing things like ski patrols. They're doing mountain assaults, the whole 9 yards. And in fact, there are a few ties that connect here. There's a guy named Hannes Schneider, who's now famous as, there's a ski cup named after him. He ran a ski school in the Northeast. During World War I, he was an Austrian military ski instructor. And so he was training Austrian troops in ski tactics. During World War II, he was too old to serve in the U.S. Army, but he was up at Camp Hale and helped them figure out the Schneider way of skiing. And his son was of military age. His son actually served in Tenth Mountain. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, if you like, I'm happy to meet you over at the table and explain some of the equipment that's out there as well.